Witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie.
A warm welcome to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, during the Polish presentation of the Great Reset report about changes in the European Union. Let me start with greetings of our guests, who are not taking part in the panel itself, but are with us here in the room. Speaker Krzysztof Bosak, thank you for your presence and for your interest in the report. And a greeting to Ryszard Kiszkowski, president of the Schumann Institute, a partner of the report, whose comment we will hear after the event. Also participating in the event are the co-authors and reviewers and active politicians. So all those who are directly involved in changes in the European Union or diagnose our concerns about the development of the European Union. So let me start with the reviewer, Professor Ryszard Legutko. Also with us is a co-author, Rodrigo Ballester, from Mathias Corvinus Collegium, and also MEP Anna Bryłka, a warm welcome, and Dr. Jarosław Lindenberg, a co-author of the report, and MEP Marcin Romanowski, and MP Marcin Romanowski. Ladies and gentlemen, the report was presented 4 weeks ago at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, 2 weeks ago at the Mathias Corvinus Collegium. Today, it's the Polish edition of the report is being presented here in Warsaw. So we premiered in Madrid, in Brussels, in Rome, and who knows where the weeks ahead will take us, because it turns out that our report hit the mark. It hit a niche, and this is how we diagnosed it in September last year. In September last year, in this very room, there was a meeting, a conference, and during this meeting, organized by Ordo Iuris and the Heritage Foundation, and there were think tanks from the whole of Europe, and they debated an alternative for the radical leftist project of the EU reform, a project that has already been approved by the European Parliament, comprising 267 amendments, leading the EU toward a super-state modeled on Spinelli's ideas. And since then, we have created a report in close cooperation between Ordo Iuris and Mathias and MCC. But more circles are joining us in particular countries. But there are very unexpected allies too. I mentioned the fact that the report was being translated into Polish and Hungarian, but the liberal press has outrun us. Last week they published French, Spanish, and Italian translations. On one day, they discussed, in the leading journals of these countries, they discussed our report and its purposes. Of course, from a totally hostile perspective, from the perspective of radical proponents of the EU superstate. But the fact that they noticed the report and preceded by Anne Applebaum, the wife of, her husband, Sikorski, it showed there was a need to propose a very specific offer of EU reform or a completely new entity, because these two directions are shown by our report. So let me start with Mr. Rodrigo Ballester. While Ordo Iuris prepared a report about changes in the EU last year, commenting on all the 267 amendments in the EU, a person who joined us straight away when we suggested creating a report, and we needed experts who would join the team and who would bring in their enormous expertise about institutional questions. MCC became our ally straight away. and Rodrigo Ballester, the director of the European Center. What was so important for MCC when they decided to get involved with their knowledge and expertise? And finally, what was the Hungarian reaction to the report? Let me just add that those of you who need it, they may take earphones with simultaneous interpretation at reception.
First of all, I'm very honored to be among distinguished speakers like you, like all of you. And also, I wanted to stress that it all started with a good friendship. And it continued with a good friendship. It was really a pleasure to draft this report together. It was a very smooth exercise. Jerzy, when you ask about, the Hungarian reaction, let me start with that, because the Hungarian reaction already happened years before. I think one of the antecedents of this report is the debate on the future of Europe, which was a debate organized, piloted, and cooked by the European Union, especially the European Commission and the European Parliament, that sparked some debate in European society, but at the end of the day, the result is as if only federalist people would have participated in that. And actually, the Hungarian government worked a lot on it. They had some concrete proposals, also the Hungarian parliament. So you have already materials on that. And also the other antecedents is that now that the European Parliament adopted this report that indeed will create, without really telling us anything, more than a super state. It will be really the dream of a centralized European madness. And it seems that, there's only one way of looking at Europe. And this is the echo we get since years already. Every time there is a reform of the treaties going on, and here there is one going on, because this report of the treaty basically triggered a procedure. And the next step is for the heads of state and government to say, let's go, let's open the treaties, let's reform them. And then again, I dedicated 20 years of my life to the European Union. You always have the Pavlov reflex of whenever you open the discussions about Europe, it must be for more Europe. What happened in 51 or in 57 was only the beginning, but it's a linear process. It's very Hegelian, or even Marxist, so to speak. It can only go in one direction. And it's true that if you look at the academic debates and at the reports of think tanks, very, very, very few would dare before to say that, sorry, there's also a way, to think about the European Union from a national and national sovereignty point of view. And so some did it during this debate on the future of Europe, but again, this debate was totally hijacked. I'm sure, Mr. Legutko, you were in the European Parliament by then, and you saw that this was a mockery of a social consultation. And so there were antecedents, and in Hungary, the debate was already somehow alive. And so at the end of the day, it's true that I think now that, for example, also the German and French government already commissioned a report by some think tanks, pro-European, very pro-federalist think tanks, to again engage and frame the debate in this one direction only. I think it was very good timing, and also, again, a very good idea and cooperation to put on the table something that seems extremely disruptive, but when you think about it, is not so much. We are just saying that to a certain extent, the first scenario that we have in this report is called back to the roots. Back to the roots means that can we just go back to the origins of the European Union? This is a point for debate indeed, but at the end of the day, what is very shocking is that anything that is not centralization and federalization is perceived as a blasphemy, almost. Because for too many people, the European Union is no longer a pragmatic way for states to cooperate, but a cult. A very ideological cult. So any critic against the cult is tantamount to a blasphemy. And that's why I think also this report was so successful.
Bardzo dziękuję, a też jednocześnie ogromnie dziękując za
Thank you very much for this very, very personal involvement, for your personal involvement in this report. That was a great adventure where, in a sense, we blazed a new trail. You mentioned that we have to do with a cult, with a European cult, with a sort of denomination around European integration. And this report has, this report is it may awaken a debate. And now a question to Professor Ryszard Legutko, a reviewer of the report. A question which is also addressed to a politician, a former politician, who as Vice President of the European Conservative and Reformers, an MEP, at the very heart of the European Union in the European Parliament, observed these processes and was also able to observe them from a perspective, from a more complex perspective, a perspective of the theory of the emergence of the state and the need for European cooperation. First of all, what direction is the European Union heading toward? And second, what could the role be of this report? And more widely, the initiatives that might try to restore Europe to its roots connected with sovereign national states. Professor? Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The European Union, as it is, has no chance of change. To cite a classic, this skull will not smile anymore. This cult that you mentioned, this kind of thinking is very strong there. The only way I see is pressure on the part of the member states, some of the member states, social pressure, the pressure of citizens. We have to realize that in percentage terms, the number of people who are dissatisfied with the direction taken by the EU and those who want change is quite significant. But it requires coordination and organization, and it's a good thing this is happening. It's one of those moves that are necessary. This system is rotten, and I say it with full responsibility. All the rules, all the good political principles that Europe worked out during its history and political thought, they are violated there. Let me just point to three things, because there is little time. First, they haven't created a system of equal entities. So we have, there are extreme disparities. There are more equal, some are equal, some are more equal. And this happens at the council, where this system, this voting system is very bad. There is ostracism, and there is political selection in the European Court of Justice, and this subservience of the European Commission toward the strong ones. It can't go on. It's a road to despotism, and this despotism is in the making. Second, they didn't want to create hard, distinct lines between competences between member states and EU organs. Well, if we had talked 20 years ago, some things were obvious, that some people are not under EU competences. Things such as the legal system of a member state, or moral issues, taxes, education, defense. After 20 years, without changing the treaties, these things have been grabbed by the European institutions. This means that the system is sick. No member state couldn't have accepted it. And these processes would have been condemned as authoritarianism, dictatorship. And third, they didn't want to create a representative system in the European Union. So to keep the principle of democratic legitimacy of institutions. No European institution has a serious democratic mandate. Some of them don't have it at all. They don't have any democratic legitimization, like the European Commission, whose, well, its power is increasing. And to put it bluntly, it's a group of no-names, and suddenly they are tasked, they are given enormous powers over member states, but of course not over all of them. So it's lawlessness. The European Commission is the driving force of lawlessness. What we see in France, in Romania, what's happening in Poland, it already started earlier in the European Union, and we saw that in the European Parliament. This is where it started. So the only solution now is that these institutions don't deserve to be given so much power. This power must be limited significantly, and we have to create a system that will show very clearly the boundaries of competences and will create some protective mechanisms. And it's not there now. Those mechanisms that are not working at all, not at all. So it can't go on. And to put it jokingly or in a literary way, it always reminds me of Mary Shelley's novel of this doctor who wanted to create a wonderful creature, but a monster came out. His name was Frankenstein. Thank you very much.
This very sharp diagnosis that the professor is presenting, you can see in the charts, in the pages of our report, because this is how we start the diagnosis by. And it leads us to conclusions that relate to the reform by itself. This we will discuss in a minute, but coming back to the question, what has happened to the European Union? Where are all our hopes that we had with it, with cooperation within the framework of EU, that were so widely spread, were so common in the process of integration? So with this question, I would like to ask Jarosław Lindeberg, our ambassador and former retired diplomat. As a diplomat for many years, and especially in this access process, he was there. And after the deputy minister in the last government of the United Conservatives, from the practical side, he could have seen the transition from the EU and the change of the Polish relationships with this European project. So, what are the directions that the EU is heading? What is going on with it? Can you hear me well? Yes. Jerzy Kwaśniewski has asked me to go briefly, and I will really try to close my summary in 5 minutes. I will really try and do my best, because this topic is a really big one. But ladies and gentlemen, first of all, a very small differentiation. We should not identify two different names, two different topics, European and Europe, or all adjectives, or for example, European in some, meaning the same as from the European Union, Euroscepticism, Euro-enthusiasm. Even in our guest balusters, there is the name, the European project. Of course, we, in our report, we could not go around this obstacle because the European Union is in Europe, and it's not just about 27 countries being members, and in Europe there are 46 countries, yes? So we can definitely say that the sickness of the stomach is in the stomach, but it's not the part of the stomach. So this is how I would say about the EU. Europe is, and I have to say that, is a very finished creature, because it is a kind of civilization, a reality that has occurred in history created by nations. And there were three main steps of it. The Christianity, I'm not telling about in chronological order, but all the accession, Christian accession and its ethics and the concept of the human being. Later on, the Greek philosophy, Aristotle, and the Roman law. So the European Union is an artificial creature, is a kind of invention, ideological invention, even though not in the shape as it was formed at the beginning. If we talk about the Union, and it's hard to say about it nowadays without looking at its history and origins, because it's a political body that keeps evolving in one way, one direction, not necessarily the one that is desired by us, and it has not yet reached the final stadium, but it's close to it. So I would say that most people who are here has definitely voted in the referendum 22 years ago for being a member of the EU, and nowadays we are in the situation of this knight that was supposed to kill the dragon and get married with the princess. After 20 years of marriage, well, actually, I did it all wrong, the other way round, because this is what the European Union looks like now. It's not the same as 20 years ago. It's not a European community. It's not the same as it was mentioned in the Parisian Treaty, etc. So the Union is evolving towards a super centralized country. This is a communist project from the Ventotene Manifesto that has been implementing through 20 years of his years in the European Parliament. So the super states in the EU, actually I would rather call it a socialist creature. So this project has not found its end, but each crisis, real or not, invented by the European bureaucrats, we see that the national sovereignty is taken away in order to give this biggest monopolist part, like in Germany and France, the governors. So they take away from us all our dreams from the communist times, because we really wanted, we had those dreams to be in the European Union and get the freedom in a very widely notion. So economically, we have no freedom at all, but this is what is mentioned in the report, because the overregulation of the European economy proves that we have no freedom. And it is going according to the leftist ideologies and many other crazy ideologies. We have no individual freedom. It was taken away from us by those ideologies that are governing, that are ruling in political life, neo-Marxist, LGBT, etc., genders, all the woke movements, etc. It is dominating in universities, education, in the mainstream media. But any opinion that is against it is repressed as the fight against fake news, etc. And also the cultural freedom is taken away from us, scientific, artistic one, etc. What I would just like to add at the end, this is not what has happened in just one act, in one movement. This is a kind of tactics that many leaders in a Hungarian communist like Rákosi was, he called it salami strategy, like taking one slice of salami after another. We call it in our Polish language boiling the frog. So we are increasing the temperature slowly, slowly. We are not boiling yet, but maybe we will save the frog. This is how I will end. Thank you very much.
So we have just started our diagnosis here in these few voices with some general statements. In the report, we go into great detail, of course, and we point to a number of footnotes. We're not the first to diagnose these things. We just sum up the debate that's been taking place for years, as Rodrigo mentioned earlier. The sovereign side is criticizing the direction the EU is taking. But now we need to talk about concrete solutions before we ask active politicians about the necessary direction to take. There's a question to Rodrigo. What are the basic assumptions, in your view, the major assumptions of the model of going back to the roots, this so-called optimistic model of our report, where we assume that the EU is still capable of being reformed?
Thank you. Well, for example, a lot of our proposals cover the point that you just made about the allocation of competences. You know, in an organization like the European Union, it should be very, very clear who does what and who gives a mandate to whom. And actually, if you read Article 5 of the treaties, it says very, very clearly that whatever has not been given explicitly with a mandate to the European Union remains a national competence. And in reality, as some of you stressed, it is exactly the opposite. And this is for me the golden rule. Saying that is like saying that football is played with the feet and not with the hands. But at the end of the day, it's played with the hands. And so a lot of the proposals we have basically just mean to clarify this golden rule that was in the treaties at the very beginning. Second, I think it's also very, very important to recover the sense of national sovereignty by giving, you know, like that. So the center of gravity is the European Council. The European Council is the meeting of the heads of states and government, the big bosses of the EU. Big bosses should be the ones setting the direction, and not the Secretary General, also called European Commission. It's crazy when you think about it that today, when, you know, to this very cliché question of who do I call to speak to Europe, the answer is probably Mrs. von der Leyen. Why? Why? And so we also have very clear proposals that go in that direction. And then we also give, and this is almost, I would say, a federalist idea. I mean, at least one that has been discussed in very federalistic circles. We propose Europe very much à la carte. We propose to give a lot of flexibility to the member states to make sure that the appetite of every member state can be adapted. Some want to go very far. This is their choice. But why should we, when you go to a restaurant, why should you always order the 5-course meal that only 3 or 4 are ready to eat? And again, this is not a Europhobic idea. Quite the opposite. A lot of federalists, you know, those who are fed up with unanimity, who hate unanimity, say, oh, we should go in that direction. Well, here it is in our report. But the difference is that for us, I think indeed the national sovereignty and the respect of national red lines, you know, should be basically like the golden rule. For example, we also propose to extend unanimity. This is a very counterintuitive proposal because today in Brussels, I mean, everyone, absolutely everyone, criticizes unanimity. All the proposals, even from the nations, even from the member states, go in that direction of, oh, let's get rid of unanimity. Well, we think the exact opposite. Personally, I love unanimity. I fell in love with unanimity, and I want even more unanimity, and I think this is the best way to guarantee you know, like the solid European Union that is based on the interest. Something that Professor Legutko said before is that not everyone is equal. Some are more equal than others. Imagine a European Union without unanimity? Who will dare to contradict France, Germany, maybe Italy, maybe Poland, and maybe Spain? No one. So de facto, abandoning unanimity will be like to give a de facto unanimity to the big states to the detriment of the mid-size and small ones. This is exactly the opposite of what the European Union was meant for. This is exactly the opposite. If one day the European Union becomes even more than now a kind of directoire of big countries that are imposing their will on small countries, then this is the end of the European Union. And it's happening today. Look, all the fuss about the rule of law, the conditionality of the budget and everything, we can see today that it is used with the sole purpose of sanctioning political dissident positions like the ones in Hungary, a country that is not favorable to migration, gender, also that has a totally different opinion on the war in Ukraine than the others. I mean, today we see that, okay, then let's suspend their rights to vote. So now we have the confirmation, and you know something about it here in Poland, that the rule of law is merely, if not only, a political pretext to impose a political line, to toe the line. And if you don't follow it, then you're going to be sanctioned. And if you follow it, the billions are going to flow. And this is exactly what happened in your country. With one government, 137 billion euros were confiscated. The moment this government changed, everything was fine. And in the meantime, the two countries I know best are also good examples of this arbitrariness. Look at Hungary. Their students, their professors, and their researchers are still excluded from Erasmus and from Horizon for nothing, for literally nothing. And even when the Hungarian government puts a legislation on the table, the Commission says, always finds a little millimetric detail to say that it's not enough. And look at Spain. In Spain today, the government for already years has been criticizing the press, the judges, the night and day. Then the general prosecutor is basically like a poodle of the prime minister. And I could go on and on and on with concrete examples. And what was the reaction of the European Union so far? No comments. Silence, radio silence. And so when you reach this level of arbitrariness, then this is an autocratic pulse. And it is happening in front of our eyes. Indeed, this is the salami tactics, and people get used to that. And to my sadness, it is happening with the complicity of the member states, because we always tend to criticize the European Parliament. Fair enough, the vast majority of the MEPs go in that direction. Or to criticize the European Commission. But all that, I mean, the Green Deal, the conditionality, all those legislations have been adopted with the blessing of the national member states. So now we are witnessing a process of self-castration of the national interest by the guardians of the national interest. We are seeing how member states are abdicating their power. And so at the end, you don't have a equilibrium, like a balance of powers anymore. It's not true that the European Council and the Council of Ministers is guaranteeing the national sovereignty, because all this process of national harakiri happened with their authorization. They actually did it. They were the ones doing the harakiri to themselves. And so this is also the problem of the current mechanism, and that's why it should be radically changed in order to find this balance again. And let's start with unanimity. I think, general unanimity rule will very much benefit the European Union.
Bardzo dziękuję.
Thank you very much. In the report, we can see there are 23 proposals, very concrete, detailed postulates of changes that should come back to the Schuman model of Europe, the nations' Europe. So we can show you some of them, this pressure on unanimity, the flexibility, the free competition of different programs of deeper integration that can opt in, opt out for those governments that see the need of creating new projects within the EU. This is just a part of it. Personally, I usually draw people's attention to one of the points, which is our Dodge, Elon Musk for Europe. That's the proposal that from the moment of adopting the deep reform, the coming back to the roots, to create a rule for 3 years, we would see the ECJ law heritage reviewed during those 3 years. If we don't find unanimity to keep this act in binding, they should just fall and be destroyed. They should be renegotiated, for example. Maybe some of the regulations would be just for narrow parts of the members, maybe some of the other one, and maybe some of them are not enough to create the basis of the whole community. And one more proposal that we show in the report, and the Anglo-Saxons say that sometimes it's better to create something from the roots, from scratch, than fix something that is not good. For example, a completely new treaty, a completely new community that would be created in the place of EU. A very big advantage of this solution is to cut all this heritage, so-called heritage of law, tradition, the jurisprudence, and all these duties that were taken or put on the members. What is another advantage? To create a totally new model that would be built on the experience, on the negative experience of the EU, that would bet for the economic freedom, for the capital services, that would cut down the federalism. And what is the advantage? Of course, very big distortions that would be involved by the EU, change of the EU, and the transition period that would also be a kind of distortion. But maybe this solution is much more beneficial to all of us. So this is just one of the two options of the big direction showing solutions. But when we talk about those two solutions, of course, we can talk a lot about the theories and show all different ideal models. But in the end of the day, when it comes to the organization and international organization and its law and legal frame, what is the most important? What is possible in the political area? And here the first question for MEP Anna Breuka, who is a member of Parliament, of the European Parliament. She's there with her compatriots in the sovereignty areas. What is the atmosphere when we talk about the reform, the sovereignty reform that we're discussing today? So what are the chances? What is the atmosphere in the European Parliament to overtake to get the majority in favor of this back to the roots or the deep reform? Thank you very much for your invitation and for preparing this report, because I really think it's an opening of the debate about what should be the future of the EU and, widely speaking, also of the whole Europe, because this is not only about the EU, but it is all about our relationships between different members that are in Europe. And thank you also very much for drawing attention into the diagnosis and the drawbacks that are destroying the EU from the inside and that lead to the situation where the EU has lost its sense of existing, all the disadvantages, the democracy deficit, the centralization, the loss of national sovereignty, what Professor Legutko has mentioned, the more and more competences that are taken by the EU, which leads us to all the member states that they lose the tools to influence the policy of the EU and all the crises that appear in the EU. For example, the pandemic in 2020. Now we have the crisis with the USA, the Ukrainian war, and all those crises are used to as a pretext to create a super powerful state. So all we can see that all these solutions, they are heading towards a super state. So all the discussions are between federalists and the conservatives that want to go in favor of the sovereignty. And what has been mentioned, as you have mentioned, I belong to the group that wants to keep the national sovereignty. But after those few months of working, and the European Parliament shows that, of course, I'm not naive, the reform of the EU is not possible to be conducted. We have to reset totally and start from the beginning, from scratch, all the relationships in Europe. So everything that should be the point of reference are the economic areas, and as you have said, coming back to the roots, how and why the European Union was created. I am in favor of creating the relationship between or among the states in Europe to just go down to economic cooperation, economic relations. That's a very big change. That's a revolution. But the trend that we are looking at in the European Union proves us that we are going towards an economic suicide and the loss of a good power, a good position in the international market. And we are really sinking with the whole European Union. And in my opinion, coming back to this, for example, unanimity, for the last few months, I've been observing how this unanimity is being built. For example, the commerce policy. Until now, there was a kind of consensus between all the member states, but now it's not working anymore. The 27 countries have so many different interests, and when the EU tries to overtake next competence, education, defense, the last topic. So we see that we are not able to build unanimity in all those areas. So we will see what will happen. I can't even foresee the future, of course. There are many concepts that appear because the federalists try to create a kind of different speed union. So in some countries might be more integrated, for example, but maybe there should be a second circle, third circle of cooperation, or other countries from the first circle, for example. But I know I should get to the end of my speech, but this equality, all the policies that have been mentioned here by the speakers, we wouldn't have the Green Deal, we wouldn't have all those strange laws if not for the agreement of all the member states. And there would not be any reform, any big reform in Europe if we do not change the governments of the member states that would be more in favor of sovereignty. And the example of France that was mentioned by Professor Legutko, what has happened there? It shows us in Romania, and the former commissioner shows that the EU, with its tools, will influence the elections in the member states' elections. So what does it mean? We are losing our democracy, the basis, the foundation of Europe or European Union. That is a kind of value that are the really core value of the whole Europe. So we see that the treaty does not reflect the real values like the Roman law, the Christian values, etc.
Thank you very much for this decisive voice, and it's good for this voice to resound in Brussels, but it is a huge problem. Let me go back to the last point you mentioned, this democracy question. It's small wonder we have issues with democracy. If the European Parliament prepares 267 amendments which are reminiscent of the Ventotene Manifesto. So this manifesto attacks democracy as a destructive principle that has to be done away with. One more thing, the equality of the member states. There is no equality of the member states. And what happened, well, as exemplified by the Hungarian presidency that was boycotted for half a year. There is no such thing there's no such thing as equality between member states. As we listen to this voice from patriots in the European Parliament, now to give the floor to Dr. Marcin Romanowski, whose political party belongs to the European Conservatives and Reformers. The question is, how does the second of these parties, how does that perceive the chances for European reform? And I refer to your long experience as Deputy Minister of Justice, who represented Poland more than once in EU institutions. How do you see the possibility of reform and building a bloc that would be necessary for starting reforms within the EU? Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation, and I congratulate you on this report. It is very necessary because this discussion concerning the future of the EU and the future of the whole of Europe has reached a very decisive stage. And to answer your question, let me just put forward two theses, initial theses. The first one is that since the decline of since the collapse of the project of the European, today's establishment is not okay with that failure, and now we have another attempt. Now, a more controversial thing is a lack of agreement for a thesis about the return to the roots, because in my view, European integration, even that from the early 50s, its genotype had some centralization in it. When those masks dropped, de Villiers describes that very well. But it's not just that, but the discrepancy between this construct is inherently those constitutional values that stem directly from Christian thought, like subsidiarity, which is a dead letter, or human dignity, protection of human dignity, that is now its contrary, or the protection of the common good, which doesn't function, doesn't exist, and the divorce between the throne and the altar. There was talk about it in the context of a certain ideology of centralism, or woke ideology, took the form of a sort of contemporary secular religion. Well, what can I say? We could discuss for a long time about practical possibilities, but I think we won't reach our goal that we're discussing about if we don't realize one key thing, I think. From the legal standpoint, I would say that the issues concerning the institutional system and the shaping of the Court of Justice of the European Union, I think they are key in this discussion. And I don't know if that is not what we should focus on. The fish goes bad from its head, and we have to take care of it from its head, starting from its head. If we look at other integrative projects, where those quasi-court organs are the driving force of this integration, this is happening in the case of the European Union. This tussle for competences is a good example. So I would risk a thesis that this head can't be cured. It must be cut off. The question is, how far is it possible for any community to function without a common judiciary organ? But to answer this question, I think it's the key debate here, or at least adding some elements who I would call the following. I will refer to an event from Polish history a small constitution that was in force until 1997, which said that the constitutional court's rulings were not final, but could be revoked by a majority. So when you mentioned that 3-year period of acquis communautaire, this unanimity or all the rulings of the CJEU, I think this rule should be part of the institutional system because it confirms the sovereignty principle and it rejects this approach that we are dealing with these days, not just on the EU level, but also on the level of member states. Some oligarchization or juristocracy. In my view, that's the biggest threat to the contemporary political systems and freedom and the sovereignty principle. So if we're discussing, if we're debating the possibilities of reforming what is there, I think we have to think in terms of more like far-sighted. I think our adversaries act like that. So it's a wave. They put forward solutions that are unacceptable to stop midway. That's one issue. But another, if I may be a little provocative here, I don't have any experience in the European Parliament, but I'm just thinking about one thing. What value does this institution have? Let me say it perversely. We speak about a deficit of democracy in the EU institutions, but I think it should be a chance, it could be seen as a chance, not a problem, because these institutions could be brought to the level where they should be brought down to as far as their competences are. Maybe they're just redundant. If we don't have a European nation, if we don't have a political community in the full sense of the word, and in Aristotle's sense of the word, I can't see any added value. Of course, if we're talking about the European Union as an institution without its competence, or about a new institution stripped of its competence, I can see that in institutions like the CJEU or the European Parliament, because as we all know, every institution tries to overreach, to grab its powers and to grab more competences and to justify its existence. Well, to conclude, let me just say that this Doge, this European Doge, could be called an executionary movement that is known from history. I think this is how we would perceive its role. But when it comes to the present situation and the possibility to act, to change, I will just say what you said, what's happening in Romania, in Poland, in France, we have to treat that as an attempt to destroy the structure of sovereign states and to show their uselessness, their redundancy. This is how I see it. This rebellion of the courts in Poland that we have been dealing with for a long time here in Poland. But I absolutely agree with the thesis that the key to the mending of this is on the side of the member states. So the sovereign approach and focus on the member states winning in these member states. That's the best way. for the process of not so much of integration, but the process of the thinking of some cooperation, economic cooperation. This process could be well shaped, and because it is the member states that should be the main actors under the treaties.
For your voice, a very practical one, I should say, related to the reform. I wanted to say that you draw the attention to the same elements as Anne Applemont or the liberal media in Europe that has been underlying that the horrible reform wants to close the European Commission, the ECJ, the EP, all should be destroyed and abolished. So what is left after such a comment? Whereas in reality, we are pointing out that conferring the whole decision power to the member states, sovereign member states, all other organs should be just helping. The ECJ should not be just considered like a real court. It's just an arbitrary organ. The European Commission is not a government. It's just a body that should help. And the EP should be a place of consultation of, at the best, there should be the representatives of member states, because if not, they would be totally away from the real problems. Now we would go to the second part. All of you that are here, if you want to ask any kind of question, please feel free to fill in the cards that you were given, or you can be given, and then I will pass the questions to our speakers. So if you have any questions, please write them down. So we have showed more or less the directions and invited all of you to read the report. We've been asking ourselves, and this is a question to Professor Legutko, what is the role nowadays in the EU reform of Poland? What role has Poland, and how we can judge, observe, let's say, in the middle of the presidency of the Polish presidency, in the context of the national interest and the reformatory activities of the EU? Thank you for this question. So I have to say that the rotation of the presidencies is a total fiction. This is a kind of right that everybody, one after another, in the queue, we are the governors of the European Union. This is a bullshit, I must say. Nobody remembers about those presidencies, or if there was maybe some kind of German presidency or French. So maybe then there is something that is pushed within this period, and it's done quite effectively. But if we agree that the member states, those so-called governments, are the keys, then of course the Polish government is in favor of the status quo. It does not want to change the process of the centralization, of the federalization. So this role is a very bad one, and we know about it because the slogan, "Are you for the EU or against?" it was used as a kind of weapon. We can talk a long time about the Polish and their attitude towards the European Union, their hopes, their disappointments, etc., that were based actually on the lack of knowledge, or the knowledge that was not a real one. So I'm really ashamed, and this is also, I feel guilty because of that. So once again, I'll repeat, the key are the governments of the member states. If there are a few of them, at least, that are interested in the reform, then yes, something might start happening from the head, let's say. But at the bottom and the rest, the grassroots movements are very necessary. In France, in Romania, in Poland, they are the effect, and they are organized so that such kind of governments do not exist. And when we talked here about the postulates of abolishing the PE, this is something good without any doubt, without any discussion. Margaret Thatcher has once called the PE the Mickey Mouse Parliament, but it has not this role anymore. It's an institution that is really bad, detrimental one, that has a lot of power and got a lot of power, and it's using it in a very wrong way. So if there's something that we can do with the Commission or the Council, the Parliament is absolutely redundant. It should be really abolished. But if we say about the CJEU that has, and its role, it is also a very bad one. From the very beginning, the early 60s of the 20th century, when this activity of this court, the European Court, was coming down to the introduction into the legal system of things that the member states, even at that time, were not decided to include in the treaty. So the primacy, for example, of the law, of the European law, in 1962. Next. Next, jurisprudence, and what is very typical of it, we were talking about this lack of willingness or self-castration of the governments. Even then, we knew what was going on. And even those who were in favor of de Gaulle in France, 60s, 70s, and even Margaret Thatcher, they did not decide to stay against, to face this challenge of the growing jurisprudence power, European one. So they did not resolve the problem, and without resolving it, the system will keep going on, because this is what it is based on. I think that the member states, maybe they would be a bit more courageous, but they are really ridiculous, shameful, and acting against their own interests. And this is the truth. But this is a topic for maybe another meeting or another story, because there are, of course, I have many conclusions about that, but maybe not today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have 100% concurrence that the European Parliament should be dissolved. But to go to the thought about the necessity of gathering the support of governments, I remember that when Balázs Orbán opened our conference, he said that the report does things that so far have seemed impossible in the sphere of possibility. So the moment these projects, what's seemingly of a very daring reform or replacing one institution with another, are written down, they suddenly enter the sphere of political possibility. And now a question to Rodrigo Ballester. When you speak about allies for such courageous actions, where are we to look for allies in Europe?
In many places. In many places. I just want, before answering to your question, I just wanted to stress that, you know, our report, and again, just to make the point that this is the reactions of some of us, of some of them against our report are very dogmatic. In our report, we put a lot of different solutions on the table, even on the European Parliament. For example, I might even disagree with most of you. I mean, I could live with a parliament that is composed of national delegations, even half, you know, so half elected MEPs, half national delegations, as we proposed. I can even live with a parliament that has a legislative role, but not on equal footing with the council. So there you have a lot of nuances in this report. And yeah, so I feel a bit like the federalist in the room here. But again, it's our report is actually very, very nuanced in many ways. And also, don't think, this is more for the audience, that this is only a debate for experts and that it's very complicated. No, some of our proposals are crystal clear, can be understood by anyone. For example, look at proposal 16 and 20. In proposal 16, we say, for example, that no one in the European Union should make more than 10,000 euro netto per month. So that should be the salary of Mrs. von der Leyen. Is it so Europhobic to say that? That only 10,000 euro netto in your pocket per month? Is that Eurosceptic to say that? Look at Proposal 20, where we say simply that the judges of the European Court of Justice should be subject to some basic rules of conflicts of interest. I mean, the people lecturing everyone on the conflict of interest should be the first one to apply a minimal standard to themselves, because today it doesn't happen. And for example, the German judge of the European Court of Justice is the former head of cabinet of the president of the Commission, Mr. Barroso. That's not normal. I mean, I'm not criticizing this person personally ad nominem. This person is a very respectable person, probably. But it remains that there is a huge conflict of interest. So a lot of our proposals are common sense. And that's also to answer your question, Jerzy. I mean, those things can be understood by millions of European citizens. And millions of European citizens who are now saying, okay, there's something rotten here. We should somehow take back control. For example, on migration. When we propose in our report that according to the principle of subsidiarity, some member states should be able to take back control of their borders. I mean, we just put some technical words on the message expressed by dozens of millions of Europeans today. So those are allies. For example, when we speak about repatriation of some national competencies on migration, we have it there. Look at, for example, even on defense. I think the example of the European Common Defense, or whatever it is called, Rearm Europe or anything. At the end, if this is a very consensual idea where 27 member states are willing to take some steps in that direction, this is unanimity, this is consensus. Hence, it is in our report, and there again we can find a lot of allies. To be more concrete, because I don't want to be too theoretical, last week in the European Parliament, there was a vote where all the right-wing conservative / patriotic / sovereignist parties won a vote. This vote was to call the Commission to prohibit any funding of campaigns promoting the Islamic hijab. And so for the second time in this legislature, for the second time, first time was Venezuela, now it's the Islamic hijab, or the EPP, this very chameleonic party called European People's Party, decided to vote together with Patriots, ECR, the Alliance of Nations, and so basically the coalition of the right was there. Do you think we can find allies there? Do you think that all our ideas will be rejected by this part of the EPP that still did not totally lose its mind? So we can find allies there. And also look at all the national representations of, think about Spain, France, think about also the Netherlands, Sweden. There are a lot of countries where those questions that we put in our report are going to resonate. So as you said, once they're in paper, people start believing that they can be realistic. And so the first step is this report. The rest is for us to convince them, but I see like millions of allies, potential allies.
Bardzo dziękuję.
Thank you very much. Millions of allies. That sounds really nice. It sounds good. Like a project that might be successful. But truly, when we were preparing this report, we were thinking mainly about offering a whole bunch of solutions, not just to talk about one very solution. So the construction of this report, those two options that are given, coming back to the roots or a total new project instead of the EU, it's also just the top of the iceberg, because if we look deeply into those options, we see that there are many flexible and modal solutions that are going deeper or less deeper. It should be a kind of guide, a kind of chocolate box where the politicians that are ready to reform can choose from. They can choose their own tools, because each step towards mending the EU is a very welcome one. So a question now to Dr. Lindenberg, when we talk about what we should choose from all of it. So can you ask the question, if we can reform the Union, the European Union, can we create the fraction in favor of the reform within the EU? So this is the question, which of those two scenarios is less realistic, is it? Well, I remember discussions at the end of the 70s when I was discussing philosophy at the university. Can we reform the communism? We were talking about the socialism with human face, the Polish socialism, etc. So how did it end? We all knew it was impossible to reform. When Gorbachev started to reform the Soviet Union, we all know how it ended up. So all the implemented ideological leftist projects from the times of Marx cannot be reformed. They go just towards one direction, and this is what happens to EU. It goes towards total control over economy, political life, social life, morality, sovereignty, etc. of the member states, and on the minds of their citizens. So all the reforms are definitely impossible to be implemented. They will be abolished. I would applaud all of those who would try, give a try, but I predict a very big failure. So, in my opinion, the only sensible solution is the abolishment of EU, this strange creature that we have all created, because we cannot do anything about it. But please, take into consideration that if we talk about the abolishment of EU, what can we replace it with? That's crucial. There are some formulations. This is, of course, a kind of technical language and nomination. The European Union, Economic Union. It's a kind of cooperation of European countries, their economies, based on the sovereignty of the nations, which is the highest value, the biggest one, and everything else should be going according to this interest. So it is not just about the economic cooperation, ideology, education. Of course, we also can cooperate, but it must be said very strictly that the new form of cooperation, this new organization, this new union that will be created, that would be created, it has to be said that this institution has not and will never have a legal entity, will have no signal, symbols, emblems, coat of arm, motto, slogan, etc. The constitution of the member states are the highest legal acts, the highest jurisprudence, and no other international institution cannot change anything in it. So, of course, we can say that the economic cooperation should be based on the freedom, migration of service and capital, but this is not just the main truth, the core and impossible to debate one, because all national states should have their tools to defend their interests also within the area of economy. And for example, if you have the uncontrolled migration within the framework of multiculturalism and destroying the European culture through a very big flood of culturally foreigners to us, we have to defend our sovereignty, our culture. And I want to draw your attention to one more point. If I don't know how to call it, if it should be an economic union or how do we name it, it does not really matter. Instead of the Soviet European Union or any other name, we have to be aware of one thing. When I talked about Europe as a counterpart of EU, which is a reality of civilization and historical heritage. This is quite an abstract notion. Because Europe, if we do not talk about the geographical continent, it's an abstract notion. But what is the reality are the nations. And these nations should have their identity, their own culture, history, their tradition, but they also have their interests. And in many cases, in many areas or moments, those interests would clash. So this organization should enable them to cooperate, even though the interests are different. And of course, the shape of cooperation or how deep it should be is just a matter of discussion. But where it is possible, it should be promoted. But where we have the conflict of interest, the organization should be one supporting, looking for consensus or making the differences not that big, because it's impossible to create such an international organism, an organization that would bring all the interests to one. So we know how it was already, it has been introduced this way in the Soviet times. So we have to learn to live with all those clashes, even if this new reality instead of EU.
So when we wrote this report, there were clashes between the co-authors. So we had views starting with those sympathizing with the reform of the EU and finding hope in resurrecting the European project through very radical statements saying that there is no hope left for the EU. So the idea of the report is to prepare ground for all those who challenge today's state of the EU and to point to different paths and solutions. But then we run into a very critical question. What answer could be presented by Ms. Anna Bryłka, an MEP? So the question is, do you want to weaken the EU? Do you want to destroy our hopes and chances? How do we answer this question? Is the sovereignty-oriented reform an attack against common strength? So where should we look for allies for this kind of strike? But the assumption is that the EU is strong, but I think it's not. And year by year, it's growing weaker. And what I am interested in as an MEP, especially a Polish MEP, is representing Polish interests. So the priority for me is to represent Polish interests, Polish national interests. Yes, Poland is in the EU, has been there for 20 years, but the costs of our presence there are growing. So even those who are very much in favor of the EU note the costs. So what you said, I'm very happy that we have started a debate about Poland's presence in the EU at last, about the costs of our presence there, because even the benefits that are touted by the proponents of the EU, that are touted very much in the debate, like the common market, but Polish businesses have barriers there, which are not spoken of very frequently, but they are there. So when we go into the legislation, we'll see that there is a regulation, but then the Commission adopts another executive regulations, and Polish companies are cut out in different ways that we can't even imagine. When we go into those details, very specific sectors, it turns out that the European Commission uses various tools to cut out these businesses. We have to start a debate on this. We have to start, as Poland, I speak as a Polish MEP, we have to prepare for scenarios that are they're not obvious, like the disintegration, the collapse of the EU, about competences that we transferred to Brussels, and now we don't have them. We haven't had a trade policy for 20 years. And how are we, well, if the EU collapses, how are we to start having a trade policy overnight? So every responsible government has to prepare for these unobvious scenarios. And I think the most important conclusion that I would like to conclude with, we should end with this kind of mentality that the EU will last forever. I think from the Polish perspective and the Polish political class, the EU will last forever. We have to stop with this. We have to drop this mindset because it closes us in a very limited debate, and we should widen the debate. Where do we look for allies? Where my party, the group I work in the European Parliament, is a group of allies where really these foundations we are in agreement. So sovereignty, agreement on that we shouldn't transfer competences to the EU because we are at this stage. So from the Polish perspective, the most important thing is to be prepared for every possible scenario. Thank you very much. I remember a statement that kind of concurs with yours by Mikos Santo during a panel that inaugurated the premiere of a report in Budapest. And then he said, perversely, we have to carry out some of these scenarios to save the EU. Because if we don't reform it in a thorough way, it will just go bankrupt by itself. It will disintegrate, that you mentioned. But it also means the necessity of some kind of awakening of political circles that have to revalue their attitudes. So perhaps a difficult but a necessary question to Dr. Marcin Romanowski, a member of the government who favored centralist tendencies in the EU, and whose leaders, like Mateusz Morawiecki, are very clearly against the deepening of cooperation, for example, in the area of the Green Deal. So they want to turn away from that centralist policy. Is it a pan-European tendency? And does that apply to the Polish political circles, the United Right? Can we speak about the revaluation of these?
I think, yes, we can say. Now all the Law and Justice parties talking about the sovereign Poland. I had the chance to, in the Ministry of Justice, to work on the European cases in July 2020. This phase, it turned out the ending phase of negotiations related to the conditionality mechanism, and as a political environment we wanted to be against, but we were not determined enough, and the majority in Poland was not enough. So we were missing this kind of unanimity also in Europe. So as an answer, I will say that I have a good experience, and here a very big thank you to Rodrigo and what he said about this community and his help, because during 5 years I was working on family law and European law in the context of European law, and this unanimity rule where it was, we were able to block any solution that was related to the gender ideology. And so we can see that it is possible, even though we have just, for example, one ally like Hungary, to reach some of our aims, to achieve our goals. So from that time, I would say that luckily many things has changed. There is a kind of waking up what is going on in Poland after 2023. I would say that is also a kind of shock to all in Europe. We are a kind of experimental place where the pro-sovereign or sovereign-oriented environments are being destroyed. There is a whole fight. We talk about also in Hungary, Peter Magyar, the leader of the opposition. He wants to follow the Polish Tusk way. So fighting against the adversaries, the political adversaries. So those who suffer are common people, that are involved in this very brutal political machine. But when we look in a positive way, I would rather look at our common, I'm talking about Poland and Hungary, our neighbor, about Slovakia. This is an example how the political environment were quite far from this viewpoint on the conservative viewpoint, but when we mention the notion of sovereignty, they start to join us. And I think that in the future, it will be a kind of natural ally for us. So I think it is a chance for the European Union as a kind of project, political project, based on the community to mend its basis, if it is still possible. This is also, I also shared this doubt about the possibility of mending it. And I would totally agree with MEP Anna Baryłka that indeed we should create different scenarios in all negotiations. The condition sine qua non of the success is to have a basis, have a kind of punishment, let's say. So it is very important in the context of national interest of Poland, for example, of Hungary or any other member state. But we also should see it, look at it on it as in common categories, alternative solutions. For example, how we look the Central Europe cooperation, for example. I'm not really talking about maybe real possibilities or solutions of creating an economic community in the Central Europe only, but what I wanted to say is that it's worth thinking about the future. It's worth doing what is feasible, what is possible. For me, it is quite real to work on some kind of consensus based on these very good values within Europe, of our civilization, of our, for example, human rights defense in Central Europe, that could be a kind of alternative to Strasbourg, that has already lost a long time ago all the core values that were declared at the beginning, at the origin. But we have to think in categories of kind of punishment, or how to make people to be scared of the consequences. And the report, also the solutions that were mentioned in the report, if not the EU, then what? There must be some kind of alternative ideas, and this is the only way where we can go in practice. We can go ahead in this discussion to mend the EU and to improve something that has been totally degraded in Europe with this EU project that is completely not working nowadays, and it shows its lack of efficiency, and to show the inhabitants, the citizens, all the dangers, the safety issues, also from the migrants, and show also its economic non-efficiency and its lack of development. Thank you very much for the suggestion. We are really working in two directions. On the one hand, we are thinking about the new reports, about 10 areas of the limitations of development growth in the European Union. Well, we have a lot to choose from, really. We have a lot of topics. But if we want to choose the 10 most important ones, we really have a lot of ideas. But when we look at the concept of the Central Europe, there were some works on that, on the Czech institution, Patrimonio Sancti Alberti, to sign alternative treaties. So they are not just about Poland and Hungary. And where are they born? Essentially in Central Europe, where this concept of sovereignty is still alive, where this attachment to national thoughts, to the defense of self-independence, and the non-acceptance of the European dictatorship is very widely spread, and it's a quite common story now. So in the end of this panel, part. We will come back to our panel speakers. I would like to give the floor and ask for some comments, and please to collect all the pieces of papers with the questions, because we would like to answer them. So when we talk about comments, I would like for a short comment Ryszard Krzyszkowski from the Schumann Institute, and if there is a will of speaking, we would like to hear Krzysztof Bosak's comment.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation, for inviting the Schumann Institute to this very important initiative, and to congratulate you on your courage to take up this topic. Because, as you said, in lots of places, there was talk about this, but nobody dared to come out with it. Because I have little time, I've only prepared some content that I'd like to present an outline that will either repeat elements of the discussion, or perhaps I hope I'll be able to add something on the part of the Schumann Institute. Our editor, Anna Wiak, is our specialist on the European Union, and I draw on her ideas here. And she's a specialist on dangers on the part of AI, this newest threat. So I will just read it out for you. So the Schumann Institute is in favor of the second scenario of the project prepared by the MCC and Ordo Iuris. And that's why we suggest dissolving the EU in its present shape and starting from scratch, from what Robert Schuman started, so from economic cooperation. Why? Because an authentic community is based on specific shared values. And we, as European countries, we mostly don't have them, at least at the moment. And then another point, today during this ideological war, no well-functioning institution can be built. Point 2. Well, hence, as has already been mentioned, we should dissolve European institutions like the CJEU, the European Parliament, the Commission. These institutions are executors of the interests of big capital, and not the will of the member states, of the citizens of the member states. This way, the member states will regain their decreasing sovereignty. So these institutions should be replaced with a commerce chamber, enabling trade, and then the center of power will be transferred to the governments of the member states, and democracy will be restored. To restore the rule of law in Europe, understood as the law, it's not enough to win an election, but we have to overcome the whole philosophical core based on 3 pillars. The first pillar, Trotskyism, the Trotskyism of Spinelli, the neo-Marxism of the Frankfurt School, and the third pillar, the deconstructionism of Jacques Derrida. And the following 3 points concern artificial intelligence. That is what Anna Wiak likes best. No matter which scenario is carried out, we have to guarantee straight away, we have to ensure that artificial intelligence is ideologically neutral and is not used in the cognitive war. That's why the Vilnius Convention should be revoked, which was signed on our behalf by Ms. Jourova, and all the other regulations on artificial intelligence. There is no room here for amendments. We have to create new rules, new provisions that will ensure that AI is a mere tool, is a mere working tool, and not a tool for ideologization. And the last point, the competence in this area that the European Union assumed under the guise of fight against Russian misinformation, they should be transferred to NATO, which should carry out the strategy in this cognitive war. And that's it. And once again, congratulations on taking the bull by the horns. And I wish you victory. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. I would like to congratulate all the authors of this report. I will show you my stand on that. I would not believe in all the reforms of the EU. I have been already talking about it in public. I think it's really not probable that to make it, because we would have to get the consent of all the member states and create a new treaty, and without any treaties there is no union. And I really doubt that in all the member states will be governments elected that would support this kind of reform in the frame of the conservative shape. So if there is, just one change of the government, it's really not probable as I see it, the zero probability. I think that all the points are interesting and practical, and I think it's a good basis. Thank you for preparing it. And all the points that have been here enumerated, they make us see that all the things that were constructed to be used in a very specific way, they are used in a different way. So we have a kind of double agenda, one that is declared, and the real one is different, is federalist, is centralist. It has a whole ideological value in it. And the official one is very peaceful, in favor of economic growth and cooperation. So it triggers a kind of whole new way of thinking about sovereignty. So this kind of proposal of creating something from the scratch, this is something that we need. Because the EU or any kind of EU organism should support just the member states, because this is the process that is going on. We should in all our governments, defend our sovereignty. We should take it back and enable our leaders to be more courageous. So this is worth proposing. What is worth mentioning, it should be desirable to take away from the EU the para-state power that it has, an authority. It is not a supranational of Europe that we have. And I think that here in this report, as I have looked at it, it's a very delicate one when it comes to the basic things, coming to pointing that the EU wants to be a super state, like the existence of the PE. I agree with half of the proposals. I think the EU should be more based on economic, and any kind of European Parliament should be created, formed by the representatives, the MP of the nations. So when we have a specially created on purpose separate parliament, it requires a whole new sphere of common things, like the procedure of electing, of voting, all the competences. And in my opinion, like the 50-50 dimension, like 50% will be from the EU and maybe 50% will be from the very member states delegated here. It is somehow stopping in the middle, in the midway, to make it clear that we do not want to create a quasi-state. So it's like standing somewhere in the middle. We want to build something, a little bit of a supra-state with theoretical democracy, but on the other hand, we don't want to so much. So I think that this solution will definitely trigger a lot of discussion. It's a very it's not a strict one. And I think that a very good solution, even when keeping all those entities, those bodies, would be to transfer, to reshape. We could even do it now. It could still keep functioning. If we change the PE in the meeting of MP members from different member states. Thank you very much for your voice.
I'm reminded of an anecdote. I can't change how true it is, about one of the first visits of Marshal de Gaulle, who addressed the French delegated for work in one place, and he said, "I can see a Frenchman here," and there is something in it when it comes to MEPs and the structure that's directly elected, but then it receives this higher remuneration. 2 questions before we close today's meeting and encourage you to read the report carefully. The first question to Mr. Ryszard Legutko: is it possible to dismantle the EU or to deeply reform it, to return to sovereignty in a situation where we make new commitments on the European scale when it comes to defense, for example? Well, I don't know this, of course, but I think something can be done, because otherwise we can organize seminars and it is meaningful. But this nervous reaction, a very aggressive reaction of European elites shows that they feel threatened. So there is room for maneuver, for action. How will it turn out? Will it be a solution that will satisfy all of us? Well, it's usually these solutions that emerge are not quite good, but I think the most important thing politically and mentally is to break this mindset that these things have to move toward deeper integration. This ever unifying Europe, that's an idiotic saying that is out there, that it's like riding a bicycle. You have to go on pedaling. I think a lot of what's happening in the EU, and it's not just these big players, but a lot of people take the position that it has to go on happening like that, that it will move on, whether we want it or not. There are some cranks protesting, some fascist governments. We will bring them to order, but it will move on because it has been moving on. It works very bad. There are constant troubles. There are no achievements, but it's moving forward. So if we manage to break up this mindset, if there is a change, a reversal, a withdrawal, an element of rationality, I think this in itself could work in the foreseeable future, because this organism is very weak, and it's just using this initial momentum. But if we are able to show that this is weak, that at one point it starts to go back, it's going to be a huge change, a psychological one, and giving an impulse, a political impulse. Just to add to what Professor Legutko has said, the question is purely technical. What do we do with the common debt of the EU when the Union is dissolved? And there will be lots of questions like that. What about thousands of officials the whole estate of the EU, real estate. There are EU delegations, and there is real estate. Well, severance pay for dismissed employees, and investments. Will they be financed, or do we just leave them? There will be lots of questions like that, but these are technical questions. The point is elsewhere. Will the European nations be willing to dismantle this monster, to kill this monster called the European Union for the common good? And now I'd like to ask you for the rest of the panelists for a short 60-second summary, starting with Mr. Ballister.
Thank you very much. Just to come back to this debate about whether we should get rid of it or we can reform it, in my view, the problem is not the original treaty of 51 or 57, let's say 57, the Treaty of Rome. For me, the problem is Maastricht. To cut a long story short, this is the moment where the European Union made the big leap forward from an economic, pragmatic cooperation to a political federalist one. So when we wrote this report, what I had in mind is Europe before Maastricht. I liked it. A very integrated market with some solidarity mechanisms among member states, and with the prominence of like member states as like the official shareholders of this union, I could live with it. I think that at the scale of history, that was already a very beautiful type of cooperation. My point is that too much integration is killing the integration. And again, the starting point of this deliquescence, of this decadence, was the Treaty of Maastricht. This is when we started speaking about migration, about environment, about the superpowers to the European Parliament, for example, about the European citizenship that is giving so many problems. Not because we all feel like Europeans or European citizens, and for example, we like to circulate among our member states. So for example, Schengen should be kept, in my view. I don't think that if we now ask the European citizens, oh, let's get rid of Schengen, they will not be very happy about it. So again, if from a political point of view, there is a lot of discontent with the European Union because citizens have the impression that it went too far and it does not longer serve their interests. But probably the vast majority of Europeans wouldn't like, to start from the very, very beginning. And so again, let's be pragmatic. This is something that we should also keep in mind.
Bardzo dziękuję. Pani poseł do Parlamentu Europejskiego Anna Bryłka.
Thank you very much, the MEP Anna Bryłka. Well, first of all, from the perspective of Poland, we need a debate that is based on arguments and facts and not emotions. And I remember very well the year that has been called very often 2020, when we working here in Poland in our parliament, we were just voiced over by the COVID, about the COVID foundation that was going to our common debt. So if we do not cooperate on facts and the law, we will still live in this illusion. And it also happened 2 or 3 weeks ago in Poland, when we were talking about the anti-missile in the East. It was not really related to it. It was really showing the real direction of reforms of the defense in Europe. For example, what should it be voted unanimously, giving next and next, conferring next laws to the EU. There was no debate, and this is what we're missing. Professor Romanowski. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I see that we're facing a very important moment in our history of the European integration, a critical one that, in my opinion, is really different than many other moments of very intense integration, for example, in the 60s or when we try to create a common constitution in Europe, because now we are looking at a situation of a very far interference of EU institutions in the sovereignty of the member states. I'm talking about Poland, Hungary, Romania, and also about France. So in my opinion, the situation really requires a firm answer, a firm action to all the integration process that have been started by Scholz in Prague, and on the coalition agreements of the previous government in Germany, especially in the context of a situation that if really Donald Trump stopped the globalization, then the globalist character of the EU would be transformed eventually into a tool to implement the German and French interests. And the answer, sovereignty-oriented people, should be very firm, strict, as well as the attack that we are suffering from. And the cooperation of all the conservative environments, and not only, because I think it would be not enough, if we look at the European societies and their state of mind, we should really make other environments join us that are anti-migration, they are pro-sovereignty, to be able to answer in real terms to these very real dangers that we are facing. And of course, kind of reflection is also needed here. And this is why I'm really so grateful for this report, and I really would like to see some other works of this type in the future. Thank you for your final comments. Thank you for your participation in these debates, for our guests. Just to end up this debate and maybe also opening a new stage of the EU reforms, I can surely say that all the partners that were involved in creating of this report, all these environments that met here in September last year, and all the members that have their strong sovereignty, pro-sovereignty movements, all this environment will definitely keep working on further reports. Two of these areas were already mentioned here, term limitations for the EU, or the concepts of the Central Europe cooperations that might be considered alternative to the mainstream, the European mainstream. And of course, those analytical areas are many more of them. So we want to build this core of analytical cooperation that would be the content background for the sovereignty movement in the EU and also in Europe as such, so that this very detailed, concrete proposal would get a lot of voice and be loud in the public debate and also in the policy of the EU. And here special thanks for all those that were involved in this work, in the report, also to all the Institute Ordo Iuris and our volunteers and our sponsors. And I really invite all of you to read it. It is available in Polish and English on our website, Ordo Iuris and MCC websites. And I really invite you to follow this debate that will take place in further cities. And it started in Washington, not because it's a special patron of this kind of debate that we can consider USA this way, but please, it turned out at the last moment that we had to change from Brussels. That will take place in May, and Washington was the first one. But it all ended up well, because the premiere in Washington in Heritage Foundation, in a closed meeting of analytical environments related to this foundation, the shock of the leftist political scene in Europe was much bigger than it would be if we started with Brussels. So the surprise was a big one, even though we did not, that was not our aim. Of course, it is important that all the reflections on the EU reform will not be just restricted to the EU or to Europe as such. We have to cooperate with our transatlantic allies. when we look at the Western civilization, we have two lungs that have to cooperate together. So this is why it is so important from the very beginning, this cooperation with Heritage Foundation and other partners from our on the transatlantic level. And even as we had this conference last year in September. Once again, very big thank you to all of you.